Most citizens across America have no awareness that this development has transpired. Surprised, a complete Supreme Court determination, all 9 magistrates in agreement, has substantially transformed retirement approaches throughout the entire nation. Not merely one jurisdiction, not merely one benefits program, every jurisdiction. Furthermore, this determination does not exclusively influence those presently retired. It expands into the monetary prospects of those intending to retire during the subsequent 5, 10, or perhaps 20 years. Thoughtful. In case you maintain a retirement benefit arrangement, add funds to a 401k, obtain Social Security payments, or have determined your retirement destination according to tax regulations, this determination could substantially influence your circumstances. What renders it exceptionally remarkable is not exclusively the determination, but rather the circumstance that each magistrate from the most traditional to the most progressive consented regarding the equivalent constitutional foundation. Such occurrences happen rarely, and whenever they transpire, it customarily suggests the tribunal believes something fundamental concerning constitutional law needed clarification. Within this situation, the inquiry was basic yet profoundly consequential. Are jurisdictions permitted to revise retirement guidelines after citizens have previously structured their monetary circumstances surrounding those guidelines? Throughout history, jurisdictions have maintained they possess this capability. Legislative bodies have recalculated benefit structures, modified eligibility periods, imposed additional levies on retirement earnings, and adjusted economic projections that numerous citizens depended upon when organizing their monetary futures. Yet this contemporary Supreme Court determination establishes an unmistakable boundary. It creates a countrywide constitutional guideline that might prevent governmental bodies from revising guidelines after people have previously made consequential monetary judgments. To put it differently, the anticipations you had while organizing your retirement may presently have lawful safeguards that were previously absent. And that represents precisely why constitutional specialists are designating this one of the most consequential retirement determinations in recent memory. Yet to comprehend the complete importance of this determination and its probable consequences on your circumstances, we must examine the situation that created it because it originated with merely one retiree objecting to a jurisdiction regulation. On this platform, we investigate intricate constitutional and monetary progressions and convert them into understandable, applicable information that carries genuine consequence for your retirement, your finances, and your monetary protection. Because the actuality is, numerous significant determinations impacting retirees transpire unobtrusively within courthouses and legislative bodies long before they become newsworthy information. And by the period most citizens become aware of them, the monetary repercussions have currently started happening. That represents precisely why this Supreme Court determination deserves comprehension at this moment. Within the subsequent minutes, I will describe precisely what the tribunal selected, the reasoning behind unanimous agreement, and in what manner this determination could impact retirement taxation, pension safeguards, and monetary preparation in all 50 jurisdictions. We shall examine which demographic segments stand to gain substantially from this determination and what actions you might contemplate implementing to maintain your retirement strategy as you move ahead. Because this situation did not commence as an extensive nationwide legislative conflict. It commenced as a disagreement between a solitary retiree and a jurisdiction administration concerning whether retirement guidelines could be changed after someone had previously invested years organizing their monetary choices depending on those guidelines. That singular disagreement ultimately progressed throughout the judicial hierarchy until it arrived at the highest judicial authority in the nation. And what the magistrates determined has subsequently instituted a contemporary constitutional guideline that all jurisdictions must follow. The situation that precipitated this determination did not commence as a nationwide political confrontation. Actually, initially, it presented like an ordinary disagreement between a retiree and a jurisdiction administration. The retiree contended that the jurisdiction had revised the guidelines controlling retirement assistance after citizens had previously invested years organizing their monetary situation under a wholly different arrangement of presumptions. The jurisdiction, conversely, presented a position governmental bodies have professed for ages, They maintained they possessed the authorization to revise retirement-connected regulations as conditions dictated. They maintained that the officials should maintain the adaptability to adjust taxation frameworks, benefit formulas, and monetary guidelines as market conditions transform. From the governmental viewpoint, retirement frameworks represent merely a component of the comprehensive taxation and financial organization, and governmental bodies require flexibility to regulate those frameworks when monetary hardships materialize. Yet the retiree comprehended the position distinctly. From that perspective, retirement organization isn't a selection individuals make rapidly. It demands many years of gathering resources, putting funds, figuring, and making existence selections depending on the guidelines that are in position at the time. Individuals determine when to cease employment, the amount to gather, what resources to employ, and even which location to inhabit depending on those guidelines. And the retiree's contention was straightforward yet persuasive. When the administration permits citizens to organize their monetary future depending on a particular lawful arrangement, it shouldn't have the capability to adjust that arrangement afterwards in a manner that disadvantages the very populations who depended on it. That contention advanced throughout the subordinate judicial levels until the situation ultimately arrived at the Supreme Court. And whenever the magistrates examined it, they didn't exclusively address the disagreement between one retiree and one jurisdiction. They employed the situation to institute a countrywide lawful guideline that currently is relevant across the complete nation. In an agreement by all justices, the tribunal backed the retiree and determined that governments cannot merely revise the retirement guidelines in manners that negatively influence citizens who organize their monetary selections depending on current regulation. That might appear like a restricted specialized concern, yet the consequences are substantial because retirement organization depends entirely on extended duration projections. Citizens don't merely gather funds. They formulate approaches around taxation consequences, benefit structures, employment termination periods, and assistance measurements that are meant to stay constant throughout time. Whenever these guidelines transition unexpectedly, it can seriously interfere with a monetary approach that demanded many years to formulate. And that represents precisely the disruption the tribunal determined required more robust constitutional safeguarding. At the core of the determination is a principle the magistrates identified as reliance interests. It represents a judicial phrase, yet the notion supporting it is straightforward. Whenever citizens make consequential life choices depending on the guidelines as currently in position, the governing body cannot afterward adjust those guidelines in a manner that inequitably penalizes the citizens who depended on them. In practical language, it suggests regulations are unable to be changed once the match has commenced, minimum in a manner that disadvantages the participants who made selections depending on those initial guidelines. The tribunal clarified that retirement organization embodies one of the most transparent illustrations of this foundation. Think about the preparation needed for retirement. Throughout the duration of employment, a person may invest 20 or 30 years putting resources into a benefit arrangement, reserving resources in a 401k, or picking financial approaches depending on how those reserves will be handled tax-wise afterwards. They might transfer to a different jurisdiction due to favorable retirement taxation circumstances. They might determine a retirement period because that represents the point when complete assistance is attainable. Each selection depends on the conviction that the guidelines controlling retirement will stay reasonably consistent. Earlier to this determination, jurisdictions possessed significant flexibility to adjust those guidelines. They were capable of altering how advantage calculations happened, put new taxation on retirement earnings, or adjust advantage frameworks in manners that impacted citizens who had previously invested years depending on the preceding framework. Occasionally those adjustments were minimal. Occasionally they were substantial enough to restructure someone's complete retirement arrangement. What the Supreme Court has presently declared is that this category of retroactive change cannot transpire without meeting a considerably stricter constitutional benchmark. When a jurisdiction endeavors to modify retirement guidelines in a manner that disadvantages individuals who depended on the preceding framework, that jurisdiction presently must establish the modification under a strict judicial examination. And critically, the duty of verification is not exclusively on retirees to defend themselves. The duty presently remains on the jurisdiction to demonstrate that its actions justify the reliance that citizens established on the preceding guideline. That transition might seem specialized, yet in the constitutional sphere, it signifies a dramatic transformation in authority. For the initial occasion, the organizational selections millions of Americans have formulated concerning retirement are getting identification as interests that merit substantial constitutional safeguarding. To fully understand the importance of this determination, it assists to picture how retirement organization functions in practical scenarios. Picture a citizen who invested their complete occupation creating a monetary approach centered on the guidelines that were in position at the moment. Possibly they engaged in employment for 30 years, putting resources into a benefit framework that pledged a particular assistance composition. Or possibly they invested many years gathering funds in a retirement account because their jurisdiction provided favorable taxation consequences for distributions in retirement. In numerous circumstances, citizens perhaps pick where to inhabit depending on those guidelines. A retiree perhaps markets their housing, transfers to another part of the nation, and settles in a jurisdiction that doesn't apply taxation on benefit earnings or extends specific exceptions for retirement gathering. That selection influences every aspect: their housing costs, their medical attention accessibility, their cultural links, and their periodic monetary arrangement. Under the preceding lawful arrangement, jurisdictions could occasionally adjust those guidelines afterwards. A governmental assembly might determine to implement a taxation on benefit earnings, adjust how advantages get measured, or impose fresh limitations on retirement distributions. Governmental bodies typically justified those modifications by claiming that taxation governance and retirement management fall within their independent jurisdiction. In other terminology, they professed the capability to revise guidelines as necessary for monetary reasons. Yet under the lawful foundation the Supreme Court has just reinforced, these disputes presently experience a considerably stricter obstacle. When a retiree formed a consequential monetary selection depending on a guideline that existed at the time, for instance transferring to a jurisdiction because benefit earnings were tax-free, the governmental body cannot merely change that approach and assume that citizen will sustain the monetary implications. The tribunal identified that retirement organization includes extended duration reliance. Citizens regulate decades of monetary selections surrounding the consistency of these guidelines. Modifying them retroactively doesn't exclusively change a procedure. It has the capacity to interrupt someone's complete monetary prospect. Therefore, the magistrates decided that governmental bodies must recognize the reliance people establish on the lawful arrangement that was in position whenever they created those selections. This fundamentally generates a defensive layer surrounding retirement organizing selections created genuinely, depending on current guidelines. When a jurisdiction endeavors to change retirement-connected guidelines in a manner that disadvantages individuals who depended on these guidelines, that modification presently may encounter severe constitutional objections. What renders this determination much more important is that it doesn't exclusively relate to citizens that have previously terminated employment. It similarly protects those that are presently in the phases of organizing their retirement at this moment. Think about a citizen during their 40s or 50s that is putting money into a 401k or an autonomous retirement reserve every 12 months. These additions represent not arbitrary selections. They remain established on beliefs regarding how that money will be handled tax-wise afterwards, when distributions will be feasible, and what the monetary guidelines will appear like throughout retirement. Citizens create approaches surrounding these beliefs. They establish how much they require to gather, the duration they intend to continue employment, and the structure of their retirement earnings. Earlier to this determination, jurisdictions might potentially modify elements of these guidelines after citizens had previously invested many years gathering, depending on the primary framework. This ambiguity generated a dimension of hazard in retirement organizing that numerous citizens weren't cognizant happened. The Supreme Court's choice transforms that circumstance in a consequential manner. The safeguarding of reliance interests presently expands ahead in addition to backward. This means the monetary selections individuals are creating presently, putting funds into retirement reserves, engaging in benefit frameworks, and organizing prospective distributions, presently might hold constitutional safeguarding when these selections were created depending on current guidelines. For instance, when a citizen invests 20 years putting money into a retirement framework because their jurisdiction guarantees favorable taxation consequences for distributions, the jurisdiction cannot effortlessly change that approach when those additions have previously transpired. The tribunal's reasoning identifies that retirement organizing represents an extended duration operation constructed on assurance in the consistency of lawful guidelines. When governmental bodies establish these guidelines, citizens manage their monetary circumstances depending on them. The determination essentially communicates that whenever citizens depend on those guidelines for ages, the governing body cannot merely change the settlement afterwards. That basis represents what provides this conclusion such extensive ramifications for retirement guidance systems across all 50 jurisdictions. To make this safeguarding functional and implementable, the Supreme Court didn't exclusively identify the basis of reliance interests. The magistrates additionally developed a particular constitutional examination that jurisdictions presently must complete previous to adjusting retirement-connected guidelines. This mechanism shall establish whether potential approaches modifications are authorized or invalidated. In accordance with the determination, whenever a jurisdiction suggests a modification that influences retirement earnings, advantage assistance, or the taxation management of retirement gathering, the jurisdiction presently must complete a three-component assessment. The initial inquiry is whether citizens created monetary selections depending on the preceding guideline. This is where reliance becomes essential. When individuals invested many years gathering funds, putting resources, transferring, or organizing their retirement strategies depending on the premise that particular guidelines would continue to be stable, that reliance has to be acknowledged seriously. The subsequent inquiry is whether the intended modification would materially disadvantage these citizens. To phrase it differently, would the governance modification substantially minimize advantages, increase taxation, or differently harm the monetary approaches people develop depending on the preceding framework? And the tertiary inquiry is whether the jurisdiction demonstrates a persuasive cause sufficient to overcome that disadvantage. This represents where the benchmark turns dramatically more rigorous for governmental bodies. It is not adequate for a jurisdiction to simply claim that it desires to control its finances or advance its taxation framework. The basis has to be sufficient to surpass the constitutional safeguarding generated by people depending on the preceding guideline. What creates this mechanism particularly considerable is which group possesses the duty of verification. Prior to this determination, retirees that desired to challenge a jurisdiction's governance modification encountered serious obstacles in legal arguments. They needed to recruit judicial advocates, assemble materials, and demonstrate that the jurisdiction performed wrongfully. Governmental bodies, including their judicial advocates and monetary reserves, frequently possessed an advantage in these arguments. Yet the Supreme Court's choice changes that balance. Under the contemporary benchmark, the assumption commences supporting the individual. The jurisdiction has to display that its approach modification fulfills the constitutional examination despite the reliance citizens established on the preceding guidelines. That change in lawful accountability substantially improves the placement of retirees and employees organizing for retirement. In place of individuals attempting to demonstrate the governmental body wrong, the governing body presently has to clarify its selections prior to changing guidelines that citizens depended on for ages. When you are discovering this information helpful, kindly let me rapidly mention an essential matter. Within my subsequent presentation, I will describe 3 particular retirement organizing motions that monetary advisors are presently examining in reaction to this Supreme Court determination. These represent not the typical general suggestions regarding gathering additional funds or spreading investments. They are applicable approach modifications connected specifically to the constitutional safeguards this determination might give. Dependent on your position, these modifications might possibly impact the structure of your additions, distributions, or extended duration taxation organizing throughout retirement. So, in case you desire to be certain you don't overlook that examination, this represents an excellent period to enroll and enable announcements. In this manner, you'll observe the subsequent refreshment right when it's distributed because determinations like this infrequently continue separated to the tribunal. Previously, a determination institutes a contemporary lawful arrangement. Monetary specialists, governmental representatives, and retirement organizers commence modifying their approaches nearly instantly. And that brings us to the subsequent consequential inquiry. Who gains substantially from this determination? Whilst the choice technically is applicable to every individual organizing for retirement, there are several communities of citizens that might see specifically important safeguarding from this contemporary constitutional benchmark. Grasping whether you are part of these communities might assist you in comprehending the reason the tribunal's choice could hold such extensive monetary implications throughout the years forward. One of the communities most instantly influenced by this determination comprises governmental and regional governmental personnel that engage in community benefit frameworks. Everywhere within the territory, numerous instructors, emergency responders, police force personnel, public administrators, and additional public workers depend on benefit schedules that guarantee particular retirement assistance once a defined employment duration. These frameworks were created ages ago with transparent calculations that establish the amount a citizen will get once they cease employment. The calculation might rely on employment tenure, earnings foundation, or a mixture of elements that assess the concluding advantage distribution. For the majority of employees inside these frameworks, those calculations turn into the core of their complete retirement strategy. A person may invest 20 or 30 years in governmental employment, thinking that the advantage guidelines they commenced underneath will continue reasonably consistent whenever they ultimately retire. Yet in current times, numerous community advantage frameworks have encountered meaningful monetary stress. Some governmental bodies reacted by creating modifications to the framework, growing employment termination periods, minimizing monetary adjustment improvements, or adjusting the calculations utilized to compute assistance. Occasionally, these modifications influenced employees that had previously invested numerous years putting resources into the framework depending on the primary conditions. The Supreme Court's determination puts fresh judicial inspection on that category of modification. When a jurisdiction endeavors to decrease projected advantage assistance for individuals that depended on the primary calculation when they joined the framework, that guideline presently might encounter weighty judicial objections. The reasoning stays transparent. Whenever a citizen commits decades of their employment to governmental employment, depending on a specified advantage composition, they have structured their monetary prospect depending on that composition. Changing it retroactively might breach the reliance interest the tribunal has presently identified as deserving safeguarding. This doesn't suggest every advantage modification will instantly become invalidated, yet it indicates jurisdictions presently have to validate these modifications under the more rigorous constitutional examination the tribunal founded. For countless public sector personnel everywhere within the territory, that contemporary lawful arrangement might meaningfully improve the certainty of the assistance they have invested their employment striving toward. A further community that might gain substantially from this determination involves retirees that picked where to remain depending on jurisdiction taxation frameworks. This happens substantially extra usually than several recognize. When Americans reach retirement years, a single most important monetary things to consider represents the method their earnings will experience taxation. Differing jurisdictions handle retirement earnings distinctly. Certain jurisdictions don't implement any earnings taxation whatsoever. Others extend particular exceptions for advantage earnings, Social Security payments, or distributions from retirement reserves. On account of these distinctions, countless retirees transfer to jurisdictions that deliver additional beneficial taxation environments. Transferring for retirement seldom qualifies as a minimal choice. It involves promoting a house, abandoning an established neighborhood, forming fresh medical attention associations, and creating a totally fresh existence. And quite frequently, the selection is substantially affected by the belief that retirement earnings will experience particular taxation treatment in that jurisdiction. Under the lawful surroundings that remained earlier to this Supreme Court choice, jurisdictions possessed extensive influence to modify their taxation approaches. Theoretically, a jurisdiction that previously granted taxation exceptions for specified retirement earnings might subsequently opt to abolish these exceptions or create fresh taxation. From the administrative position, that modification would just represent one element of its routine influence to oversee the taxation framework. Yet for retirees that transferred specifically on account of these guidelines, the monetary implications might be meaningful. Thoughtful. The tribunal's contemporary reliance benchmark produces a substantially more powerful position that such retroactive modifications should not disadvantage citizens that organize their retirement approaches depending on the preceding guidelines. Concerned. When a retiree transferred specifically on account of the commitment of specific taxation benefits, that transfer itself presently might be deemed a reliance interest that merits constitutional safeguarding. In useful conditions, this determination might render it considerably more problematic for jurisdictions to withdraw retirement taxation assistance that citizens depended on whenever selecting where to spend their retirement seasons. There represents yet another community that might get impacted by this determination, and it's one that several individuals don't promptly consider: Social Security benefit consumers. Social Security itself symbolizes a countrywide initiative, yet the method advantages get handled tax-wise might shift dependent on your residence position. Currently, a quantity of jurisdictions still impose taxation on Social Security assistance at the jurisdiction degree, whilst others exclude these advantages wholly. For retirees, that distinction may show a perceptible consequence on their periodic funds. Numerous individuals organize their retirement approaches surrounding the belief that their Social Security assistance will get managed a particular manner in the jurisdiction where they inhabit. Certain retirees perhaps even transfer specifically to jurisdictions that don't apply taxation to Social Security advantage payments to be able to extend their unchanging earnings additional. The Supreme Court's focus on reliance interests presents a fascinating judicial inquiry regarding the direction these taxation guidelines might progress in the perspective. When a jurisdiction should transform its handling of Social Security advantage in a manner that detrimentally influences retirees that had previously structured their monetary approaches surrounding the preceding guidelines, that modification might probably encounter objections under the constitutional benchmark the tribunal recently instituted. Judicial specialists are presently examining the extent this evaluation might progress. The determination does not mechanically get rid of Social Security levies in jurisdictions that presently apply them, yet it does present a much more powerful assertion that retirees that depended on specific guidelines should not experience damage by abrupt modifications. To put it simply, while the complete implications will likely develop over potential judicial arguments, the selection has created an opening to broader judicial debates regarding the method retirement earnings, incorporating Social Security, might get handled whenever citizens have demonstrably depended on active guidelines in their extended duration monetary organizing. Yet another essential feature of the determination that numerous individuals dismiss is that it protects beyond just retirement reserves or assistance compositions. It furthermore protects the organizing selections individuals execute over their employment period. Retirement organizing isn't exclusively about the monetary resources a person gathers. It comprises a progression of significant lifestyle selections that come from the lawful surroundings encircling retirement assistance. Individuals establish whenever to terminate employment, the duration they shall maintain employment, whether they must get earlier termination alternatives, and what years they anticipate starting complete advantages. Every selection reflects the guidelines that remain in position at the time. For illustration, imagine a citizen that organizes their complete employment all around a termination age that permits them to get complete advantage assistance. That age could establish, whenever they cease employment, the structure of significant monetary selections and the method they coordinate their gathering. When the governmental body abruptly moves that termination age and implements the modification to employees that have previously invested many years organizing all around the preceding guideline, the monetary implications might be meaningful. The Supreme Court's selection proposes that these categories of organizing selections might furthermore be eligible as reliance interests. This suggests the measure of managing your employment and monetary existence all around a particular termination guideline might itself carry constitutional safeguarding. This remains particularly essential for employment fields where termination structures get created instantly into employment arrangements, for instance law enforcement professionals, responders, and extra public protection employees. Numerous of these employment fields comprise plainly identified termination time periods that employees depend on whenever creating extended duration existence arrangements. When these time periods were suddenly expanded much additional toward the coming for individuals currently in the framework, the selection signals that judicial bodies presently might examine whether such modifications breach the reliance interest these employees created over the extent of their employment phases. So what may you truly carry out with this knowledge at this moment? Comprehending a Supreme Court selection remains essential, yet the actual advantage originates from converting that knowledge into practical measures that reinforce your private retirement organizing. The initial measure specialists suggest comprises documenting the existing retirement guidelines that connect to your circumstances. This might appear straightforward, yet it might grow highly precious when guidelines ever transition in the potential. Devote energy to document the method your jurisdiction presently addresses retirement earnings. Research whether your jurisdiction applies taxation to advantage earnings, whether it implements taxation to Social Security assistance, and the method it oversees distributions from retirement reserves, just like 401ks and retirement accounts. Retain duplicates of these guidelines from official governmental sources. Distribute them. Take display captures, or maintain digital documents that visibly demonstrate what the regulations seemed like whenever you created your monetary selections. The foundation this is important connects specifically to the reliance basis the tribunal emphasized. If your jurisdiction ever endeavors to modify these guidelines in a manner that disadvantages retirees or forthcoming retirees, proof demonstrating what the guidelines were whenever you created your selections might possibly turn out to be quite consequential. Documenting your reliance doesn't demand judicial abilities. It merely implies keeping a transparent record of the guidelines you depended on while organizing your retirement. In connection with taxation approaches, it's likewise prudent to maintain documentation regarding your retirement reserves and assistance programs. Keep your advantage registration documentation. Maintain records from your 401k or retirement account profiles. Hold on to exchanges from companies that explain retirement assistance or compositions. Every piece of this material establishes a sequence demonstrating that your monetary selections were made under a particular lawful arrangement. When guidelines shift afterwards, that documentation might assist in demonstrating the reliance the Supreme Court identified in its selection. An extra measure worth examining comprises discussing this selection with a monetary specialist that comprehends the method lawful modifications may modify retirement approaches. Not every consultant will right away become acquainted with the specifics of this determination on account of Supreme Court selections regularly necessitate duration to filter via the monetary organizing neighborhood. Yet the professionals that maintain awareness of lawful progressions will previously be examining the method the contemporary reliance benchmark might manipulate retirement organizing. A well-informed specialist might support you in examining whether your present edition approach persists sensible beneath the contemporary lawful surroundings. The method your jurisdiction's taxation guidelines might modify your extended duration distributions, and whether any modifications might improve your monetary situation ahead. For governmental employees, it might furthermore be useful to review advantage arrangement records thoroughly and examine them alongside present jurisdiction governance. When there have been alterations to advantage compositions, termination periods, or monetary modifications from the duration you joined the framework, these modifications might probably increase inquiries beneath the reliance benchmark founded by the tribunal. This doesn't suggest every modification mechanically turns into unenforceable, yet it means there might presently be more robust lawful reasons to examine whether specific modifications were suitable. The objective isn't to generate unneeded worry or motivate judicial arguments. The objective is consciousness. Whenever citizens comprehend the method the guideline safeguards their monetary selections, they might carry out measures to maintain these safeguards and organize much more securely throughout the upcoming times. Earlier till we finish, there's yet another consequential fact you must recognize regarding the method selections like this transpire in the genuine existence. Whenever the Supreme Court institutes a contemporary constitutional benchmark, the judicial surroundings does not right away solidify into position. Alternatively, it commences a current period whereby jurisdictions, governmental agents, and tribunals examine the extent that benchmark genuinely moves. And in numerous instances, governmental bodies will examine means to modify their guidelines, so they presently sustain adaptability whilst methodically remaining inside the boundaries founded by the tribunal. Certain jurisdictions might reply by launching what get identified as grandfather articles. These guidelines make an effort to safeguard citizens that are presently retired while placing fresh regulations exclusively to forthcoming retirees. Different jurisdictions could perhaps execute modifications progressively over extended stretches of duration, expecting that tribunals can examine these modifications as considerably less disruptive to citizens that depended on prior guidelines. There might furthermore be instances whereby governmental agents approve guidelines that progress right up throughout the constitutional boundary founded by the selection, demanding tribunals to establish whether these guidelines go much beyond. To summarize, the account doesn't finish with the Supreme Court selection. In numerous respects, that selection represents merely the starting position. Throughout the subsequent ages, extrajudicial arguments, governmental reactions, and lawful translations shall establish the method this contemporary reliance benchmark becomes implemented throughout practice. That's the cause staying knowledgeable about progressions in retirement governance might be just as essential as comprehending the primitive selection itself. When you desire to maintain pace with the method jurisdictions react to this selection and the implications it might indicate for your retirement organizing, maintaining a connection to trustworthy details resources might produce a genuine influence. And when you identify this clarification practical, think about enrolling so you don't overlook upcoming refreshments when this lawful surroundings continues changing. These varieties of modifications barely transpire entirely at once, yet the citizens that concentrate attention initially remain commonly the ones greatest arranged to modify their approaches and maintain their monetary prospect. Currently, it's similarly essential to tackle a concern that a few viewers may perhaps be thinking at the moment. Does this selection suggest that jurisdictions might not transform retirement guidelines any further? The response remains negative. Governmental bodies persist in possessing the power to modify approaches when essential. The Supreme Court didn't immobilize retirement governance unchangeably. That which the selection performed was elevate the guideline that governmental bodies have to satisfy earlier to generating modifications that influences citizens that depended on the preceding guidelines. Jurisdictions might presently implement extra administration, modify taxation methods, or restore advantage frameworks, yet they presently must display that these modifications don't inequitably disadvantage individuals that created their monetary strategies surrounding prior guidelines. Occasionally, governmental bodies might claim that meaningful monetary strain legitimizes specific modifications. For illustration, when an advantage framework experiences hazard of monetary breakdown, a jurisdiction might maintain that revisions remain essential to maintain the framework for all individuals included. Judicial bodies shall ultimately choose whether these assertions remain sufficient to fulfill the constitutional examination. Therefore, whereas the selection generates robust contemporary safeguarding for reliance interests, it doesn't eliminate every possible guideline modification. That which it accomplishes is change the equilibrium of capability. Rather than people requiring to defend themselves versus abrupt modifications to the regulations, governmental bodies presently have to demonstrate that their behaviors acknowledge the beliefs people depended on whenever organizing their retirement. Whenever you examine the bigger circumstance, this selection symbolizes something extra substantial than only a judicial specialized concern regarding retirement governance. It represents a more comprehensive basis about impartiality and extended duration monetary organizing. Retirement doesn't represent a selection persons determine rapidly. It comprises the outcome of ages of employment, gathering, and organizing. Individuals create selections regarding their vocations, their households, and their monetary futures depending on the guidelines that remain in position at the moment. They dedicate ages of additions to advantage frameworks. They mindfully estimate the amount to gather in retirement reserves, and they repeatedly pick where to survive depending on the method their retirement earnings will experience taxation. Every selection is contingent on a fundamental belief that the guidelines managing retirement shall persist comparatively secure. The Supreme Court's settlement backing from the entire tribunal strengthens the belief that these beliefs are worthy of recognition beneath the Constitution. Whenever citizens develop their monetary prospects depending on guidelines developed by the governmental body, The governmental body cannot carelessly change these guidelines and methods that damage the approaches citizens' invested ages developing. This basis does not assure that retirement guidelines shall never evolve. Yet it communicates that governmental bodies has to carefully contemplate the genuine humanity implications of modifying those guidelines. The tribunal's reliance benchmark successfully recognizes that retirement organizing represents one of the most transparent illustrations of extended duration assurance connecting citizens and a legitimate framework. And whenever that assurance is present, the guideline has to maintain it. Ultimately, the authentic advantage of this selection shall rely on the method individuals apply the safeguards it produces. A Supreme Court selection by itself doesn't instantly assure someone's retirement prospect. What creates the distinction remains the method citizens retort to the details it delivers. When you invest the duration to comprehend the guidelines connecting to your retirement, write down the guidelines that impacted your monetary selections, and continue knowledgeable regarding the method your jurisdiction responds to this selection, you position yourself in a meaningfully more robust placement compared to one that doesn't become conscious of these transformations whatsoever. Details turns into a method of monetary safeguarding. And that's truly the objective of conversations like this. To make certain you maintain the details required to inquire superior inquiries, create improved selections, and maintain the approaches you've invested ages developing. When you identify this clarification useful, think about transmitting it to a person that remains presently retired or proactively organizing for retirement. Numerous citizens perhaps never turn into conscious of this selection till considerably following its influences commence developing technique selections everywhere within the territory. Maintaining consciousness at this moment might produce an important distinction throughout the coming period. The Supreme Court has created a contemporary border surrounding the belief citizens depend on whenever organizing their retirement. What follows shall depend on the method jurisdiction's reply. The method tribunals implement the contemporary benchmark, and the degree citizens get arranged to maintain the approaches they've invested so intensely to develop.